Close your eyes and listen to the rain. Let it wash over you as I tell you something that happened to me just 3 months ago. Something I'm still trying to understand. Get comfortable, pull your blankets close, and let my voice carry you into a world where reflections don't always show the truth. The rain outside your window tonight. It sounds just like the rain that was falling the night. Everything changed in my little rental house on Maple Street. I moved into the house in early October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air carried that crisp promise of winter. It was a small place, built in the 1940s, with hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, and windows that rattled gently when the wind picked up. The rent was reasonable, almost suspiciously so for the neighborhood, but I was grateful. I'd been apartment hunting for weeks, and this felt like home the moment I walked through the front door. The house came furnished, which was perfect, since I'd recently gone through a difficult divorce and didn't have much beyond clothes and a few personal items. The previous tenant had left everything behind: furniture, dishes, even some clothes still hanging in the closets. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, explained that the tenant had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. She seemed eager to rent it quickly, barely asking for references, which should have been my first warning. The mirror was in the master bedroom, mounted on the wall opposite the bed. It was an antique piece, probably from the same era as the house, with an ornate silver frame that had tarnished beautifully over the decades. The glass was old too, with that slightly warped quality that made reflections look softer, more romantic somehow. I remember thinking it was the most beautiful thing in the house. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I fell into a routine quickly. Morning coffee in the sunny kitchen, evening walks around the neighborhood, quiet nights reading in the living room while rain tapped against the windows. The house felt peaceful, welcoming. I started to believe I might actually be happy again after the chaos of the past year. The first time I noticed something odd was on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was getting ready for work, standing in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth, when I caught a glimpse of something that made me pause. For just a moment, it looked like my reflection was wearing a different shirt than the one I had on. I blinked, looked again, and everything was normal. I was wearing my blue button-down, and so was my reflection. I laughed at myself, blamed it on being half awake, and finished getting ready. But the feeling lingered throughout that day, a nagging sense that something had been wrong with what I'd seen. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror for several minutes, studying my reflection carefully. Everything looked exactly as it should. Same brown hair, same tired eyes, same small scar on my chin from a childhood fall. I felt foolish for worrying about it. The second incident happened a week later. I was putting on earrings before heading out to dinner with a friend, and I could have sworn my reflection put on the left earring before I did. It was such a subtle thing, barely perceptible, but it made my hands freeze halfway to my ear. I stared at myself, heart beating a little faster, and tried the motion again. This time, everything synchronized perfectly. My reflection moved exactly when I moved, in exactly the same way. I started paying more attention after that, watching my reflection more carefully each morning and evening. Most of the time, everything was perfectly normal, but occasionally, maybe once every few days, there would be these tiny discrepancies, a slight delay in movement, a different expression that lasted just a fraction of a second. Changes so subtle I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The stress of the divorce had been enormous, and I'd been having trouble sleeping. I considered that maybe the sleep deprivation was causing hallucinations, minor tricks of perception. I even made an appointment with my doctor, but when I tried to explain what was happening, it sounded so ridiculous that I canceled it. The first major incident happened on a rainy Thursday night in November. I'd been having a particularly difficult day at work, and I came home exhausted and emotionally drained. The house felt different that evening, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The air seemed heavier, and the familiar creaks and settling sounds seemed more pronounced. I attributed it to the weather. A storm was moving in, and old houses always respond to barometric pressure changes. I went to bed early, hoping to catch up on sleep, but I kept tossing and turning. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom, and as I passed the mirror in the dim light from the hallway, something made me stop. My reflection was there, as expected, but she was standing completely still while I was moving, for at least 3 seconds, maybe 4. My reflection remained frozen in place while I continued walking past the mirror. When I stopped moving and turned to look directly at the mirror, everything snapped back to normal. My reflection moved when I moved, matched my expressions, my posture, everything. But I knew what I'd seen. I stood there for nearly an hour, testing every possible angle and movement. But the reflection behaved perfectly. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I called in sick to work. I spent the entire day researching online, looking for any explanation for what I was experiencing. I read about everything from neurological conditions to paranormal phenomena. Some articles talked about mere hallucinations associated with extreme stress or sleep disorders. Others discussed the psychological effects of major life changes. I wanted desperately to believe it was something medical, something treatable. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about my mental state. Something was genuinely wrong with that mirror. Over the next week, the incidents became more frequent and more pronounced. My reflection would lag behind my movements by several seconds. Sometimes she would make different facial expressions. I'd be frowning, and she'd be smiling, or vice versa. Once, I watched in horror as my reflection appeared to be talking while my mouth was closed, her lips moving silently in what looked like urgent conversation. The most disturbing incident happened on a Sunday morning. I was getting dressed, putting on a red sweater, when I noticed my reflection was wearing something completely different, a blue dress I'd never seen before. The dress looked vintage, maybe from the 1950s, with a pattern of small white flowers. When I blinked and looked again, my reflection was wearing the red sweater, just like me. But for those few seconds, she had been dressed like someone from another era entirely. That afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about the blue dress. Something about it felt familiar, though I was certain I'd never owned anything like it. I decided to explore the house more thoroughly, going through closets and drawers I hadn't touched since moving in. In the back of the bedroom closet, behind clothes that the previous tenant had left behind, I found it. The exact same blue dress with white flowers that I'd seen my reflection wearing. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. It was beautiful, well made, but clearly decades old. The fabric had that soft, worn quality of vintage clothing that's been carefully preserved. There was no size tag, but when I held it up to myself, it looked like it would fit perfectly. I hung it back in the closet and tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I had seen the dress before. Maybe my subconscious had remembered it and somehow projected it onto my reflection. But even as I told myself this, I knew it didn't make sense. The reflection had been wearing the dress, not me. I had been putting on a red sweater. That night, I covered the mirror with a sheet. I told myself I just needed a break from the stress of watching my reflection. That maybe a few days of not seeing it would help reset whatever psychological process was causing the hallucinations. But lying in bed, I could feel the mirror's presence behind the sheet, like a watchful eye that had been temporarily blindfolded. I lasted 2 days before I had to remove the sheet. The not knowing was worse than the strange reflections. At least, when I could see the mirror, I felt like I had some control over the situation. When it was covered, my imagination ran wild with possibilities of what might be happening behind that fabric barrier. The night I uncovered it, my reflection looked different immediately. She seemed more solid somehow, more present, and she was smiling at me in a way that didn't match my own expression at all. I was terrified, but she looked pleased, almost relieved. When I raised my hand to touch the mirror's surface, she raised her hand too, but our palms didn't meet at the glass. Hers stopped about an inch away, as if there was an invisible barrier between us. "Who are you?" I whispered to the mirror, feeling foolish even as I spoke. My reflection's mouth moved, shaping words I couldn't hear. She looked frustrated, urgent, like she was trying to tell me something important. Then she pointed behind herself, into the reflected version of my bedroom, and I turned to look at the real room behind me. Everything looked normal. The bed, the dresser, the window with rain streaming down it. But when I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was gone. The mirror showed the bedroom, but not me. I could see the space, where I should have been standing, but it was empty. I stepped to the left, then the right, waved my arms, even jumped up and down. The mirror reflected the room perfectly, but not me. I had become invisible to my own reflection. The panic that hit me then was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I ran from room to room, checking every reflective surface in the house. The bathroom mirror, the black screen of the turned-off television, even the chrome surface of the refrigerator. Nothing showed my reflection. I had vanished from every mirror and reflective surface in the house. I grabbed my phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped myself. What would I say? That I couldn't see my reflection, that my mirror was haunted. I would sound insane, and maybe I was. Maybe this was what a complete mental breakdown felt like. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour grocery store, desperate to see if the problem extended beyond my house. The automatic doors opened for me, so I wasn't completely invisible. Other shoppers could see me, but when I caught sight of my reflection in the store's security mirrors, I felt my knees go weak with relief. There I was, looking pale and shaken, but definitely there. Whatever was happening was confined to my house. To that mirror, I drove back home as the first light of dawn began to filter through the storm clouds. The rain had been falling steadily all night, and the sound of it on my car's roof was oddly comforting. When I got back to the bedroom, I approached the mirror cautiously. My reflection was there again, but she looked different, older somehow, and sadder. She was wearing the blue dress with white flowers, and her hair was styled in victory rolls that belonged to another era. When I moved, she moved with me, but there was a delay, like she was reluctantly mimicking my actions rather than being a true reflection. Over the next several days, I began to understand that I was sharing my reflection with someone else. During the day, when I looked in the mirror, I saw myself tired, confused, but recognizably me. But in the evenings, especially when it was raining, the other woman would appear. Sometimes we would both be visible at the same time, like a double exposure photograph. Sometimes she would replace me entirely. I started trying to communicate with her. I would write questions on pieces of paper and hold them up to the mirror. At first, she seemed not to understand, but gradually, she began responding. She would nod or shake her head, point to things in the reflected room, or make gestures I slowly learned to interpret. Her name was Helen. She had lived in this house in 1954. She had been murdered by her husband in front of that very mirror, and something about the violence of her death had trapped her reflection in the glass. For nearly 70 years, she had been alone in that silver prison, watching tenant after tenant come and go, unable to communicate with any of them until me. I don't know why I was different, why I could see her when others couldn't. Maybe it was my own emotional state, the way my recent divorce had left me feeling displaced and disconnected from my own life. Maybe Helen sensed that I, too, felt like I was losing myself, and somehow that created a bridge between us. The communication became easier over time. Helen would write words in the mirror's condensation when I showered, leaving messages that appeared backwards to me, but read normally from her side. She told me about her life, her dreams, her terror at being trapped for so many decades. She showed me things hidden in the house, love letters she had written but never sent, photographs tucked behind loose baseboards, a diary hidden in a space behind the bedroom wall. Reading Helen's diary was like stepping into another world. She had been 26 when she died, married to a man who had grown increasingly controlling and violent. She had been planning to leave him, had been saving money, and making secret preparations. The blue dress was the one she had planned to wear when she left him. Instead, she died wearing it. As the weeks passed, I realized that Helen wasn't trying to haunt me in the traditional sense. She was trying to show me something important. The diary entries from her final weeks were filled with fear and desperate plans for escape. She had known her husband was dangerous, but she had waited too long to leave. The parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore. My ex-husband had never been physically violent, but there had been other forms of control, other warning signs I had ignored or rationalized away. Helen's story was like a mirror to my own, reflecting not what was but what could have been if I hadn't found the courage to leave. One rainy evening in December, nearly 2 months after I'd first noticed the strange reflections, Helen appeared, in the mirror more clearly than ever before. She looked directly at me and smiled, a peaceful expression I hadn't seen on her face before. She pressed her hand against the glass from her side, and for a moment, I could swear I felt warmth through the surface. Then she began to fade, not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming more transparent, like morning mist burning off in sunlight. As she faded, my reflection became stronger, more solid, more definitively mine. For the first time since October, when I looked in the mirror, I saw only myself. I never saw Helen again after that night. The mirror returned to being just a mirror, old, beautiful, but perfectly ordinary. My reflection moved when I moved, wore what I wore, expressed what I expressed. The strange incidents stopped completely, but Helen's presence in the house didn't disappear entirely. Sometimes I would find small things moved or arranged differently, not disturbed, but carefully placed. A book left open to a particular page, a photograph positioned where I couldn't miss it, flowers from the garden arranged in a vase I hadn't touched. These weren't hauntings in any frightening sense. They felt more like gifts, gentle reminders that I wasn't alone. I stayed in the house through the winter and into the spring. Mrs. Chen seemed surprised when I renewed my lease, mentioned that most tenants didn't stay longer than 6 months. I understood why now. Helen had been searching for someone who could see her, hear her, help her find peace. The other tenants had probably experienced some of the same strange incidents I had, but they had left before the connection could fully form. I finally moved out in May, not because I was afraid, but because I had healed enough to want a fresh start somewhere else. On my last night in the house, I stood in front of the mirror one final time. My reflection looked back at me, strong and whole and unmistakably mine. But just for a moment, I thought I saw Helen standing behind me, translucent and smiling, her hand raised in a gentle goodbye. The rain is still falling outside your window as it falls outside mine tonight. Sometimes, when I look in mirrors now, I remember Helen and wonder about all the souls who might be trapped in reflective surfaces around the world, waiting for someone who can see them, someone who can help them find peace. I wonder about the stories mirrors could tell, the secrets they hold, the lives they've witnessed. But I'm not afraid of mirrors anymore. Helen taught me that sometimes what we see in reflections isn't meant to frighten us, but to show us truths we need to understand. The mirror in my rental home didn't reflect me anymore because Helen needed to share that space with someone who would listen to her story, who would bear witness to her life and death, and help her find the peace that had eluded her for 70 years. And now, when the rain falls like this, soft and steady and endless, I close my eyes and remember that sometimes the most frightening things we encounter are not meant to harm us, but to teach us something essential about ourselves, about compassion, about the courage it takes to truly see another soul and help them find their way home and their way home. He died in the fire, but every winter he warms the house. Close your eyes and let the rain wash over you. Feel it drumming against your window, against the roof, creating that perfect white noise that pulls you deeper into comfort. Tonight, as you lie there listening to the storm, I want to tell you about something that happened to me last winter. Something I'm still trying to understand, even now, as another cold season approaches. Pull your blankets closer. Let your breathing slow. The rain will keep us company while I share this with you. This story about warmth in the darkest months. About presence that lingers long after absence should have claimed it. Some stories are meant to be told on nights like this, when the boundary between sleep and waking grows thin. When the familiar sounds of rain can carry whispers from places we're not supposed to hear. So settle in. Let the rhythmic patter above us be our soundtrack as I take you back to that old Victorian house on Maple Street, where I learned that some fires never truly go out, and some people never really leave. I moved into the house on Maple Street in late October, drawn by the impossibly low rent and the landlord's eager insistence that it was a steal at that price. Mrs. Chen, the property manager, had keys that jangled nervously in her weathered hands as she walked me through the narrow hallways and high-ceilinged rooms. The house had been divided into 4 apartments, mine being the ground floor unit with access to what she called the original parlor. Previous tenant left suddenly, she explained, her accent thick with something I couldn't place. Very sudden. Middle of lease. Good tenant, too. Quiet. Paid on time. She paused at the thermostat in the hallway, an ancient brass thing with numbers barely visible through decades of tarnish. Heating system is ... unique. Original radiators, steam heat. Very efficient once you understand it. The apartment itself felt like stepping back in time. Hardwood floors worn smooth by countless footsteps. Crown molding that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. And windows that looked out onto a street lined with similar Victorian houses, most of them converted into apartments like mine. The living room featured an ornate fireplace with a mantel carved from dark wood, though Mrs. Chen was quick to mention it was decorative only city ordinance. Boiler in the basement handles all the heating, she said, leading me to a door that opened onto steep wooden stairs descending into shadows. Mr. Kowalski in 2B knows how to work it, if you have problems. He's been here longest. The basement smelled of old coal and metal, though she assured me the system had been converted to gas decades ago. A massive boiler squatted in the center of the space like some industrial heart, pipes extending from it like arteries throughout the house. On the wall nearby hung a faded photograph in a cracked frame. A black and white image of a man in work clothes standing beside what looked like the same boiler, though smaller, simpler. "Who's that?" I asked. Mrs. Chen glanced at the photo, then looked away quickly. "Previous maintenance man. Before my time. Long time ago. I signed the lease that afternoon. Moving in was easy enough. I didn't have much, just what fit in my small sedan after the divorce. Books, clothes, my laptop, a few pieces of furniture I'd managed to keep. The hardest part was adjusting to the sounds of the house. Old buildings have their own language, and this one was particularly chatty. Pipes knocked and sighed, floorboards creaked in rooms where no one walked, and the radiators had their own metallic vocabulary of expansion and contraction. The first cold snap came in mid-November. I woke one morning to frost on the windows, and my breath visible in the bedroom air. The thermostat in the hallway read 52 degrees, and when I tried to adjust it, nothing happened. The brass dial turned easily enough, but no corresponding warmth followed. I knocked on Mr. Kowalski's door. He was a thin man in his 70s, with sharp blue eyes and hands stained permanently black around the nails. "Boiler's probably just temperamental," he said, following me downstairs with a toolbox that looked older than both of us combined. "She needs coaxing sometimes." In the basement, he examined the ancient system with the familiarity of long practice. "See, here's your problem," he said, pointing to a gauge I hadn't noticed before. "Pressure's too low. Has to be just right, or she won't fire." He made several adjustments, muttering to himself in what sounded like polish. And within minutes, I could hear the system coming to life. A low rumble followed by the distinctive hiss of steam, beginning to move through the pipes. "There she goes," he said with satisfaction. "Should be warm upstairs in 20 minutes. How long have you lived here?" I asked as we climbed back up. 15 years, come February. Good building, solid, got its quirks, but what old place doesn't? He paused at my door. "You having any other problems? Noises? Smells?" It was an odd question, specific in a way that suggested experience. "Should I be?" He shrugged. "Old houses remember things. Mostly, it's nothing. But if you notice anything unusual, especially in winter, just let me know." That night, lying in bed listening to the radiators tick and hiss as they worked, I noticed something else. A smell, faint but distinct, like wood smoke. Not unpleasant, just unexpected. I checked the decorative fireplace in the living room, but it was cold, the damper sealed. The smell seemed strongest near the radiator in my bedroom, a ornate cast piece that looked original to the house. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen when she stopped by the next week to check on things. "Phantom smells are common in old buildings," she said, though she seemed uncomfortable with the topic. "Pipes can carry odors from decades ago. Nothing to worry about." But as November turned to December and the weather grew colder, the smell became more pronounced. Not just wood smoke now, but something else, something that reminded me of my grandfather's workshop, all sawdust and machine oil and honest work. It was strongest in the evenings, just as the sun set and the heating system cycled on for the night. I started paying closer attention to patterns. The smell appeared most noticeably when the outside temperature dropped below 30 degrees. It would begin around 5 in the afternoon and fade by morning. During the day, nothing. But as evening approached and the house prepared for another cold night, there it would be, that warm, woody scent that spoke of fires and craft work and someone taking care of things. The other tenants seemed unbothered. When I casually brought it up with Sarah from 3A, she just shrugged. "Old building smells. I've got radiator sounds in my bedroom that sound like someone walking around, but it's just the pipes settling." Mr. Kowalski, when pressed, admitted he'd noticed something like that but didn't seem concerned. "House has a history," he said. "Smells are the least of it." "What kind of history?" "The usual kind. People lived here, people died here. Building's been apartments for 40 years, but before that it was a family home. Big family, lots of stories." He seemed reluctant to elaborate. I did my own research at the library, digging through old city records and newspaper archives. The house had been built in 1897 by a merchant named Harrison Davies. 3 stories, 12 rooms, home to the Davies family for nearly 60 years. In 1952, there had been a fire. Not a devastating one, the newspaper account described it as contained to the basement heating system, but serious enough to require the fire department. The article was brief, buried on page 4 of the local paper. "Local man dies in heating system accident." Thomas Brennan, age 34, described as building maintenance worker, had been found dead in the basement after what was termed a boiler malfunction and subsequent fire. He was survived by a wife and 2 children. The Davies family, unharmed but shaken, sold the house 6 months later. Thomas Brennan. I found myself staring at that name, wondering if he was the man in the photograph hanging in the basement. The dates would be about right, and the idea of someone dying down there in that cave-like space with its maze of pipes and shadows stayed with me longer than it should have. December brought serious cold, the kind that makes old heating systems work overtime. My apartment stayed comfortable, almost too warm sometimes, as if the system were overcompensating. Other tenants complained about uneven heating. Mr. Kowalski mentioned his bedroom radiator barely functioned, and Sarah said her kitchen was freezing, but my unit remained perfectly climate-controlled. The smell grew stronger too, not unpleasant, but increasingly noticeable, like someone burning seasoned oak in a fireplace somewhere nearby, except there were no active fireplaces in the building. I checked the basement several times, looking for some source, some explanation. The boiler ran clean and efficient, no sign of smoke or unusual combustion. The photograph of the man in work clothes seemed to watch me during these inspections. His face serious and focused, tools visible in his hands. It was during one of these basement visits that I noticed something else. The temperature down there was inconsistent. Most of the space felt appropriately cool for a basement in winter, but certain areas, particularly near the boiler and along the main heating pipes, felt warm, almost tropical. I could stand in one spot and feel perfectly comfortable, then take 2 steps and need my jacket again. I started timing these warm zones, mapping them in my mind. They seemed to follow a pattern, appearing strongest in the early evening and fading toward dawn. Just like the smell, just like the perfect heating in my apartment, while others complained of the cold. On the longest night of the year, December 21st, I woke around 3 in the morning to absolute silence. The heating system, which I'd grown accustomed to hearing cycle on and off throughout the night, was completely quiet. No rumble from the basement, no hiss of steam, no ticking of cooling metal, just the sound of wind outside and my own breathing. The apartment was still warm, which made no sense. I checked the thermostat in the hallway, 72 degrees, exactly where I'd set it, but the system was clearly not running. I could feel the difference, hear the absence of mechanical life that should have been keeping the building comfortable. I pulled on clothes and went downstairs to check the boiler. The basement was dark, except for a small pilot light on the system, casting everything in blue shadows. But as I descended the steps, I realized the space wasn't as cold as it should have been. The air felt neutral, neither warm nor cool, as if some other heat source were maintaining the temperature. The boiler itself was definitely not running. All the gauges read normal, but there was no flame, no circulation, no activity. It looked like it had been shut down for maintenance. Except I hadn't called anyone, and Mrs. Chen hadn't mentioned any scheduled work. That's when I saw him. Not clearly at first, just a sense of movement near the far corner of the basement, in the space where the main heating pipes disappeared into the ceiling. A shadow that seemed too solid, too purposeful to be cast by my flashlight. I called out, "Hello, is someone down here?" but got no response. I moved closer, and the shadow resolved into something more specific. The outline of a man, broad-shouldered, an average height, wearing what looked like work clothes. He was doing something with the pipes, his hands moving, in practiced motions I couldn't quite follow. The strange thing was how natural it all seemed, like discovering someone working late in an office building. Nothing alarming about it, except the hour and the fact that he shouldn't have been there. "Excuse me," I said, louder this time. He turned then, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. Middle-aged, serious expression, dark hair that needed cutting. Familiar in a way that made me glance toward the photograph on the wall, then back at him. The resemblance was unmistakable, though the man in front of me looked solid, present, absolutely real. "System's running fine," he said, his voice carrying easily through the basement space. "No need to worry about the heat tonight. Are you? Do you work for Mrs. Chen?" He smiled at that, the expression sad but not unkind. "I work for the house, same as always." He gestured toward the boiler, the maze of pipes, the photograph on the wall. "Someone has to keep things running proper, especially in winter. People depend on the heat, but the system isn't running. I can hear when it's off. It's running different tonight, quieter, more efficient." He moved back toward the pipes, and I noticed that wherever he walked, the air seemed warmer, more comfortable. "You've been taking good care of things upstairs, respectful, not like some tenants we get." There was something about his manner, the way he spoke about the building and its systems, that made me believe him completely. This was someone who understood every pipe, every connection, every quirk of the ancient heating system. Someone who took pride in keeping people warm and comfortable. "You're Thomas Brennan," I said. He nodded. "Been keeping the heat running since 1952. Through all the changes, all the different owners. House needs someone who understands her properly. But you died. In a fire. Fire in the boiler room. Yes. But the work isn't finished." He touched one of the main pipes, and I could swear I felt warmth radiate from the metal, though we were standing several feet away. People need heat in winter. They need someone making sure the system runs right, keeping the temperatures balanced, fixing problems before they become emergencies. I thought about the perfect heating in my apartment, the way other tenants complained while I stayed comfortable. About the warm spots in the basement, the smell of wood smoke, the photograph watching. Over everything, Mrs. Chen knows. Mrs. Chen suspects. Most of the long-term tenants figure it out eventually. Some are comfortable with it, some aren't. The ones who aren't usually don't stay long. He moved toward the stairs, and I noticed the temperature in the basement was rising, becoming almost tropical. "You planning to stay?" I considered the question seriously. An apartment with a ghost was certainly not what I'd signed up for. But Thomas Brennan didn't feel threatening. Sad, maybe. Dedicated to his work in a way that transcended normal employment. And there was something comforting about knowing someone was taking care of things, making sure the heat worked properly, keeping the building safe and comfortable. Are you at peace with this? I'm doing what needs doing. Same as when I was alive, just different now. House has been good to me. I'm good to the house. People stay warm. Pipes don't freeze. System runs efficient. Everyone benefits. What about your family? Your wife and children? His expression grew distant. They moved on, like they should have. Got a nice place across town with modern heating, reliable heat. Mary remarried a good man. Kids grew up proper. That's how it should be. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. But someone still needs to tend the boiler. Someone who knows how she works, what she needs. That's me. I followed him upstairs, though by the time I reached the main floor, he was gone. But the apartment was warm, perfectly heated. And when I checked the thermostat, it still read 72 degrees exactly. The next morning, the heating system was running normally again. Mr. Kowalski mentioned that his bedroom radiator had started working properly for the first time all winter. Sarah said her kitchen was finally comfortable. Mrs. Chen, when I called to ask about the building's heating efficiency, seemed pleased that everyone was satisfied with the system. Sometimes takes a while for old systems to balance out, she said. But once they do, they run like clockwork, like clockwork. I didn't mention my basement encounter, but over the next few weeks, I began noticing other signs of Thomas's presence. Tools in the basement would be in different positions, as if someone had been using them. The boiler's maintenance schedule, which Mrs. Chen had said was handled by an outside contractor, seemed to happen on its own. Filters changed, connections tightened, efficiency improved. Most evenings, just as the temperature dropped and the system cycled on for the night, I would smell that familiar wood smoke scent and know that someone was downstairs, checking pressures and adjusting flows and making sure everyone stayed warm through another cold night. Winter deepened, and my apartment remained a haven of perfect climate control. Other buildings on the street dealt with frozen pipes and heating failures, but our old Victorian hummed along with 19th century reliability and 21st century efficiency. When friends visited, they always commented on how comfortable the place felt, how the heat seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, rather than just the radiators. I never saw Thomas again, as clearly as that first night, but his presence became part of the house's rhythm. The smell of honest work and wood smoke. The sound of tools being used expertly in the small hours. The knowledge that someone who truly understood the building was taking care of things. As spring approached, and the heating system cycled less frequently, These signs faded but never disappeared entirely, even on warm days. There would be moments, usually in the early evening, when I would catch that familiar scent and know that Thomas was still there, still working, still ensuring that when winter returned, everyone would stay warm and safe. The house on Maple Street taught me something about the persistence of care, about how some responsibilities transcend the normal boundaries of life and death. Thomas Brennan died in a fire 60 years ago, but his dedication to keeping people comfortable, his knowledge of every pipe and valve and pressure gauge, his commitment to work that truly mattered, all of that remained. On cold nights now, when the rain drums against the windows and the heating system cycles on to chase away the chill, I think about Thomas downstairs in the basement, adjusting pressures and checking connections and making sure that everyone upstairs stays warm through another long winter night. Some people leave when their work is finished. Others stay because their work is never really done. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the sound of steam moving through old pipes, you can hear the echo of someone who found his purpose in taking care of others, and who chose to keep that purpose alive long after his own life ended. The fire took Thomas Brennan in 1952, but every winter since then, he's made sure the house stays warm. Sleep well tonight, and know that somewhere, someone is watching over the things that matter, keeping the systems running, ensuring that when you wake in the morning, the world will be a little more comfortable than it was when you closed your eyes. Some stories end with death, but the best ones continue with love. Love for work, love for responsibility, love for keeping people safe and warm when the cold winds blow and the rain falls softly against windows in the night. I heard Gregorian chants in the middle of the woods. Close your eyes now, and let the rain wash over you like a gentle blessing. Feel your body sink deeper into the softness beneath you, your breathing slow and steady as the droplets tap their ancient rhythm against the glass. Tonight, I want to share something with you, something that happened to me 3 months ago in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. Something that still visits me in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world feels thin and permeable. Let the rain be your companion as I tell you this story. Let it carry you into the deep woods where I learned that some sounds were never meant for human ears, and some silences hold more terror than any scream ever could. My name is Sarah, and I've been a wildlife researcher for 8 years. I specialize in nocturnal bird migration patterns, which means I spend most of my time alone in remote locations, recording sounds that most people never hear. The solitude never bothered me. In fact, I preferred it. There's something pure about being the only human consciousness for miles, surrounded by the honest sounds of the natural world. The assignment that changed everything seemed routine enough. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had received reports of unusual spotted owl activity in a section of old-growth forest about 40 miles east of Eugene. Local hikers claimed to hear owl calls at times and frequencies that didn't match any known patterns. My job was to set up recording equipment and spend 2 weeks documenting whatever was happening out there. I arrived at the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in late September. The Forest Service road ended at a small gravel parking area surrounded by Douglas firs that stretched up like cathedral pillars, their tops lost in morning mist. According to my GPS, the study area was a 3-mile hike through terrain that hadn't seen logging in over a century. Perfect conditions for spotted owls, and perfect conditions for the kind of pristine recordings that made my work worthwhile. The hike-in was unremarkable. My backpack, loaded with recording equipment, batteries, and enough supplies for 2 weeks, felt familiar and comfortable against my shoulders. The trail was well maintained for the first 2 miles, then faded to barely visible deer paths winding between massive tree trunks. By noon, I'd reached the coordinates where I planned to establish my base, camp a small clearing, beside a creek that would provide water and a break in the canopy for satellite communication. As I set up my tent, I noticed something that made me pause. The forest was unusually quiet. In 8 years of field work, I'd learned to read the subtle orchestra of woodland sounds. There should have been squirrel, chatter, bird calls, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush. Instead, there was only the whisper of wind through needles and the soft murmur of the creek. Even that seemed muted, as if the water was trying not to disturb something. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Sometimes forests go quiet, for perfectly natural reasons: a predator passing through, unusual weather patterns, seasonal changes in animal behavior. I finished setting up camp and began placing my recording equipment at strategic points around the clearing. Each device was programmed to capture a full spectrum of audio, from the subsonic calls of large mammals to the ultrasonic communications of bats. That first night, I sat by my small camp stove, reviewing the day's preliminary recordings through headphones. Nothing but ambient forest sounds: wind, water, the occasional crack of settling wood. Exactly what I expected from a forest adjusting to a human presence. I made notes in my journal, plotted the next day's equipment placement, and went to sleep to the gentle sound of rain beginning to fall. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to absolute silence, not the comfortable quiet of a sleeping forest, but a complete absence of sound that felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Even the creek seemed to have stopped flowing. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to hear something, anything that would restore the natural order of night sounds. Then I heard it for the first time, faint and distant. Carried on the still air like a half-remembered dream, came the unmistakable sound of human voices raised in harmony. Male voices, deep and resonant, singing what sounded like plainchant. The melody was haunting and ancient, rising and falling in the complex cadences of Gregorian chant. Latin words I couldn't quite make out drifted through the darkness, each syllable perfectly articulated despite the distance. I sat up in my tent, heart racing. There were no churches within 50 miles of this location, no monasterios, no retreat centers, no camps or cabins. I'd studied the topographical maps extensively before coming here. The nearest human habitation was a ranger station 30 miles away, and that was usually empty, except during fire season. The chanting continued for perhaps 10 minutes, never growing louder or softer, maintaining a consistent ethereal quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it faded gradually, like a radio being slowly tuned away from a distant station, until only the normal night sounds of the forest returned. I grabbed my flashlight and one of my handheld recording devices, but by the time I'd unzipped my tent, there was nothing but the gentle patter of rain on leaves and the restored murmur of the creek. I stood in the darkness for 20 minutes, listening and recording, but heard only what I expected to hear in a healthy forest at night. The next morning, I reviewed the night's recordings from all my devices. Nothing unusual appeared on any of them. The timestamp showed normal forest ambience straight through the period when I'd heard the chanting. According to my equipment, nothing unusual had happened at 3:17 a.m. I spent the morning expanding my recording grid, placing additional devices in a wider circle around my camp. If there was some kind of acoustic phenomenon happening, echo effect, wind patterns, creating unusual sounds, even some kind of electronic interference, I was determined to document it properly. The day passed quietly. I documented several owl calls that matched normal patterns, recorded the sounds of deer moving through distant undergrowth, and filled my journal with observations that seemed entirely routine. As evening approached, I found myself unconsciously preparing for another encounter with the voices. I positioned a recording device next to my sleeping bag and left another running outside my tent at 3:17 a.m. It happened again. This time I was ready. I slipped on my headphones as the chanting began, trying to isolate individual words, to determine direction, to make sense of what I was hearing. The voices were clearer now, or perhaps I was listening more carefully. There had to be at least a dozen singers, possibly more. The harmony was complex and perfectly executed. each voice finding its place in intricate musical architecture that spoke of years of training and practice. The Latin was ecclesiastical, formal, and ritualistic. I caught fragments: Kyrie, Elisa, Domini, Sanctus. This was definitely liturgical music, the kind sung in medieval monasteries during night prayers. But that only deepened the mystery. Who would be performing such music in the middle of an uninhabited forest at 3 in the morning? I grabbed my most sensitive directional microphone and crept outside. The chanting seemed to come from the northeast, deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the terrain became more difficult. I pointed the microphone in that direction and listened through my headphones, but heard only the ambient sounds of rain and wind. The chanting was inaudible through my equipment, but perfectly clear to my naked ears. This impossibility hit me like cold water. Sound doesn't work that way. If my ears could hear it, my microphones should detect it. If multiple recording devices placed throughout the area couldn't capture it, then either the sound was originating from some kind of localized acoustic phenomenon, or something was very wrong with my perception. I stood in the rain for the full duration of the chanting, about 15 minutes that night. When it faded away, I remained outside for another hour, shivering in my rain gear, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I'd heard. The voices had been real, beautiful, and completely impossible. Over the next 3 days, the pattern established itself with disturbing regularity. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the forest would fall into that unnatural silence, followed by the ethereal chanting that lasted between 10 and 20 minutes. Each night, I tried different recording strategies, repositioning equipment, adjusting sensitivity levels, even hiking part-way toward the sound source. Nothing worked. My ears could hear the voices clearly, but my instruments detected nothing unusual. On the 4th night, I decided to follow the sound to its source. At 3:15 a.m., I was dressed and ready with my most powerful flashlight, a GPS unit, and a handheld recorder. When the silence fell over the forest like a held breath, I started walking northeast through the trees, using the chanting as my navigation beacon. The forest floor was treacherous in the darkness, root systems fallen, logs creating obstacles that could easily result in a twisted ankle or worse. But the voices drew me forward with an almost magnetic pull. They were definitely growing louder as I moved deeper into the woods, though they maintained that same otherworldly quality that made them seem to resonate through the air itself rather than originating from any specific location. After about 20 minutes of careful hiking, I reached the crest of a small ridge and looked down into a natural bowl-shaped depression in the forest floor. What I saw there defied every rational explanation I could construct. In the center of the depression, barely visible in the thin moonlight filtering through the canopy, stood the ruins of what appeared to be a stone structure. Not a building, exactly, but the remnants of walls arranged in a rectangular pattern, perhaps 30 feet by 20 feet. Moss and small trees grew from gaps in the stonework, indicating that whatever this had been, it was very old. The chanting was coming from within those ruins. I could see no one, no light, no signs of human presence. But the voices rose from that space with perfect clarity, echoing off the stone walls in harmonies that made my skin crawl with a mixture of beauty and terror. This was impossible. There was no one there. My flashlight beam revealed only empty ruins overgrown with decades of forest growth. Yet, the singing continued, flawless and haunting, performed by invisible choirs in the middle of nowhere. I crept closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run back to my camp. The stone walls were clearly very old, built from rough-hewn blocks fitted together without mortar. The style was unlike anything I'd seen in Oregon, more reminiscent of medieval European construction. How such a structure had come to exist in the middle of pristine forest was beyond my understanding. As I reached the edge of the ruins, the chanting suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deeper than anything I'd experienced. Not just the absence of the singing, but the complete suspension of all forest sounds. No rain, no wind, no creature stirring in the underbrush. It was as if the entire world had paused to take a breath. Then I heard footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate footsteps moving across stone. Someone was walking inside the ruins, their steps echoing off the walls with the hollow sound of hard-soled shoes on rock. But I could see nothing. My flashlight illuminated empty space within the stone walls, moss-covered ground, a few saplings growing through cracks in what might once have been a floor. The footsteps continued for several minutes, tracing what seemed to be a specific pattern within the ruins. Back and forth, pausing at certain points, then resuming with the same measured cadence. I realized I was holding my breath, afraid that any sound I made would draw attention to my presence. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, rain pattering on leaves, the distant murmur of water over stone, the soft rustle of nocturnal animals resuming their activities. Whatever had been happening in those ruins was over for the night. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed at the structure, until I reached the ridgeline. Then I turned and half ran, half stumbled back through the forest to my camp, my heart pounding and my mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. The next morning, I hiked back to the ruins in full daylight, carrying my camera and measuring equipment. What I found only deepened the mystery. The stone structure was real enough, though much more deteriorated than it had appeared in the darkness. The walls were broken in many places, reduced to rubble in others. Several large trees grew directly through what had once been the interior space. There was no way anyone could have walked around inside those ruins without scrambling over fallen stones and ducking under branches. Yet I'd clearly heard footsteps on stone, MEASURED, and unobstructed. I photographed everything, measured the dimensions, and tried to determine the age and origin of the construction. The stone was local granite, rough-hewn and weathered, based on the size of the trees growing through the structure. It had been abandoned for at least 50 years, possibly much longer. I found no reference to any such structure in historical records for the area. The Forest Service had no knowledge of it. Local historical societies I contacted by satellite phone had never heard of any stone buildings in that section of forest. As far as official records were concerned, these ruins didn't exist, but they were undeniably real, and they were somehow connected to the voices I'd been hearing. That night, I positioned myself on the ridge overlooking the ruins well before 3:17 a.m. I wanted to observe from a distance, to see if I could detect any visual phenomena accompanying the auditory ones. When the silence fell over the forest, I trained my flashlight on the ruins and waited. The chanting began right on schedule, rising from the empty stone walls with the same ethereal beauty that had haunted my sleep for a week. Through my binoculars, I could see nothing unusual within the structure. No figures, no lights, no movement of any kind. Then the air began to shimmer. It was subtle at first, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but gradually became more pronounced. The space within the ruins seemed to waver and bend, as if I were looking at it through water or glass. The distortion grew stronger as the chanting continued, until the interior of the structure became completely obscured by a rippling, translucent barrier. When the singing stopped, the distortion faded quickly, leaving the ruins looking perfectly normal in my flashlight beam. I had documented something, but I wasn't sure what. Some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, a temperature inversion, creating optical effects, or something else entirely, something that existed at the intersection of the physical and metaphysical worlds. Over the remaining days of my study, I established a routine of nightly observation. The pattern never varied. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the forest would fall silent. The chanting would begin from within the empty ruins, and the air inside the stone walls would shimmer and bend until the singing stopped. Some nights I heard the footsteps, others only the voices, but the phenomenon occurred without fail, as regular as clockwork and as mysterious as anything I'd ever encountered. On my final night in the forest, I made a decision that still haunts me. I decided to enter the ruins during the chanting dot at 3:15 a.m. I positioned myself at the edge of the stone walls, flashlight in one hand and recording device in the other. When the silence fell and the voices began, I stepped across the threshold into the interior of the structure. The moment my foot touched the ground inside the ruins, everything changed. The forest around me vanished, replaced by walls that rose high above my head, their stones perfectly fitted and unmarked by time. Candles burned in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across surfaces carved with intricate religious symbols. The floor beneath my feet was polished stone, inlaid with a complex pattern that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light. I was no longer in ruins, but in a complete, intact building that felt ancient beyond measure. The chanting surrounded me now, not distant and ethereal, but immediate and overwhelming. I could see the singers, dozens of them, arranged in rows along the walls. They wore brown robes, with deep hoods that concealed their faces, and they sang with voices that resonated through stone and bone with hypnotic power. But when I tried to focus on any individual figure, they seemed to waver and fade, like images projected in smoke. I could see them clearly in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, they became translucent, ghostly, more suggestion than substance. The Latin words were clear now, a continuous liturgy that seemed to have been going on for centuries. This was not a performance, but a ritual, a ceremony that had transcended the boundaries of time and space to continue long after its participants had passed beyond the physical world. I tried to speak, to call out, but found that I had no voice in this place. I tried to move, but my feet seemed rooted to the stone floor. I could only stand and listen as the ancient voices washed over me in waves of sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. My bones, my soul. Time became meaningless. I might have stood there for minutes or hours or days. The candles never burned lower, the voices never tired, the ceremony never paused or varied. This was eternity made manifest, a moment stretched beyond the breaking point and held in perfect suspension. Then, gradually, the voices began to fade, not stopping abruptly as they did in the forest, but diminishing slowly, as if the singers were walking away down a very long corridor. The candles dimmed, the carved walls grew indistinct, and the solid floor beneath my feet became uncertain. I found myself standing in the ruined structure again, surrounded by broken walls and overgrown vegetation. My flashlight had gone out, but dawn was beginning to filter through the forest canopy. According to my watch, I had been standing in the ruins for over 4 hours, though it felt like both an instant and an eternity. I stumbled back to my camp, packed my equipment with shaking hands, and hiked out to my truck as quickly as the terrain would allow. I needed to be away from that place, to return to a world where sound behaved according to physical laws and ruins stayed ruined, but I couldn't leave the mystery behind. Back in Eugene, I spent weeks researching the history of that section of forest. I found obscure references in territorial records from the 1840s, mentions of a small Catholic mission established by French monks in what was then wilderness. The mission had lasted only a few years before being abandoned, its members either returning to civilization or dying of disease and hardship. There were no records of what happened to the buildings, no maps showing their exact location. The mission had simply vanished from history, forgotten by everyone except the forest that had reclaimed it, everyone except the voices that still gather there every night at 3:17 a.m., continuing their ancient ritual in a space that exists between what was and what is, between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. I've been back 3 times since then, drawn by a compulsion I can't fully explain. Each time, I hear the chanting, see the shimmer in the air, feel the pull of that impossible doorway between worlds. Each time, I resist the urge to step across the threshold again, knowing that I might not find my way back to the solid world of broken stones and overgrown ruins. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the rain falls against my window with the same rhythm I heard in that ancient forest, I wonder what would happen if I stayed, if I joined my voice to theirs, added my presence to their eternal vigil in that place where time holds no meaning, and the boundary between worlds grows thin. The voices are still there, still singing their timeless liturgy to an empty forest. And sometimes, when the night is dark and the rain falls just right, I can hear them calling to me across the miles, inviting me to return to a place where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the silence between heartbeats can last forever. Listen carefully to the rain tonight, and you might hear them too, those ancient voices raised in harmony, singing their eternal song in a cathedral made of stone and shadow and the spaces between. What we know and what we fear to discover, the basement. Door only opens when I'm alone. Close your eyes now and let the rain wash over your thoughts. I can hear it pattering against your window, the same way it patters against mine on nights like this. There's something comforting about rain, isn't there? The way it creates a barrier between us and the world outside, wrapping us in our own private spaces. But sometimes, in that solitude, we discover that we're not as alone as we thought we were. I want to tell you about something that happened to me. Something I've never spoken about before. As the rain falls tonight, as you settle into the darkness behind your eyelids, listen to my voice and let me share this burden with you. Maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll believe me. Or maybe, like everyone else, you'll think I've simply lost my mind. The apartment building where I lived for 3 years was one of those old converted factories from the 1920s. Thick brick walls, high ceilings, and a peculiar layout that seemed to have been designed by someone who'd never actually lived in a home. My unit was on the 3rd floor, a decent one-bedroom with windows that faced the courtyard. I'd grown fond of the place, despite its quirks. The radiators clanged all winter. The elevator made unsettling grinding noises, and there was always the faint smell of something floral and old in the hallways, like dried roses mixed with dust. But none of that bothered me. What bothered me was the basement door. It sat at the end of the hallway on my floor, painted the same institutional beige as all the other doors, marked only with a small metal sign that read "Basement Access Authorized Personnel Only." I'd walked past it hundreds of times during my first year there, barely giving it a second glance. It was just another door in a building full of doors that led to places I didn't need to go. The first time I noticed something strange was on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd been coming home from work, arms full of groceries, fumbling with my keys in the dim hallway light. As I approached my apartment, I heard a soft click behind me. When I turned around, the basement door was standing slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. I set my groceries down and walked over to it, assuming someone from maintenance had forgotten to close it properly. But as I reached for the handle to pull it shut, I noticed something that made me pause. There was no keyhole, no visible lock mechanism at all, just a smooth metal handle and hinges that looked as though they'd been recently oiled, despite the building's general state of deferred maintenance. I closed the door and went about my evening. But the image lingered in my mind. Over the next few days, I found myself glancing at it whenever I passed, and I began to notice a pattern. The door was always closed when other people were in the hallway, when I could hear Mrs. Chen from 3B talking on her phone, or when the college students from 3D were coming and going with their loud conversations and music. But when the hallway was empty, when it was just me walking alone through that carpeted corridor with its flickering fluorescent lights, the door would be open, not wide open, never that obvious, just cracked enough to suggest that someone had recently passed through, just enough to reveal that glimpse of darkness beyond. I started keeping a mental log of when I saw it open. Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m. when I left early for a dentist appointment. Saturday afternoon at 2:15 p.m. when I went to check the mail. Sunday evening at 9:30 p.m. when I stepped out to throw away trash. Always when I was alone. Always just that narrow gap of darkness. The building superintendent, Mr. Kowalski, was a tired man in his 60s who seemed perpetually overwhelmed by the demands of keeping the old building functioning. When I mentioned the basement door to him during a chance encounter in the lobby, he looked at me with the weary expression of someone who'd fielded too many tenant complaints. "Basement door," he said, adjusting his glasses. "That door's been sealed for years. Building management decided it was a liability after some water damage down there. Should be locked tight." I described what I'd been seeing, and he shook his head slowly. "Must be the building settling. Old places like this, doors get warped, don't close properly. I'll take a look when I get a chance." But I could tell from his tone that my concern ranked somewhere below fixing broken garbage disposals and dealing with heating complaints. He never did take that look, and the door continued its strange behavior. As weeks passed, I found myself becoming obsessed with it. I would time my exits from the apartment, trying to catch it in different states. I started photographing it with my phone, building a collection of images that showed the door closed, the door slightly open, the door closed again. When I showed these photos to my friend Sarah during dinner one evening, she studied them with the patience of someone humoring a paranoid friend. "They all looked the same to me, Marcus," she said, handing my phone back. "Just a door, but they weren't the same. In some photos, the gap was wider. In others, it was barely perceptible. And in a few, taken when I was certain the door had been ajar, it appeared completely closed. The camera seemed to see something different than my eyes did, which only made me question my own perception more. I began to develop theories. Maybe there was a draft in the building that pushed the door open when the air pressure changed. Maybe the building's heating system created temperature differentials that caused the door to expand and contract. Maybe there was someone else in the building who had access to the basement and was simply inconsistent about closing the door behind them. But none of these theories explained why the door only seemed to open when I was alone in the hallway. I tested this repeatedly, walking back and forth past the door, then asking neighbors to walk with me. Without fail, when I had company, the door remained firmly closed. When I was alone, it would be open within minutes of my previous pass. The temperature in the hallway near the door was different too. Not dramatically so, but noticeably cooler, as if cold air was seeping through the gap when it was open. Sometimes, standing close to it, I could swear I heard something from the darkness beyond. Not voices exactly, but a sound like air moving through pipes, or the distant hum of electrical equipment. I started having dreams about the door. In them, I would walk through that gap into the basement, following narrow corridors that stretched far deeper than the building's footprint should have allowed. The basement in my dreams was vast and maze-like, filled with rooms that contained the belongings of people who had once lived in the building. Furniture covered in sheets, boxes of photographs from decades past, clothing that still carried the faint scent of perfume or cologne. In these dreams, I was searching for something, though I could never remember what when I woke up. I would wander through room after room, opening boxes, lifting sheet-covered furniture, always with the sense that I was close to finding what I was looking for. The dreams felt more real than my waking hours, more vivid and immediate than my daily routine of work and sleep and the ordinary concerns of life. The smell began in November. At first it was so faint, I thought I might be imagining it. A floral scent, like lilacs or jasmine, but with an underlying note of something else, something organic and old. It was strongest near the basement door, and it seemed to intensify. When the door was open, I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen when we happened to ride the elevator together one morning. She was a practical woman who had lived in the building longer than anyone else, and I thought she might have some insight into the building's quirks. "Lilacs," she said, considering this. "There used to be a woman who lived in your unit." "Oh, must have been 15 years ago now. Mrs. Delacroix. She grew flowers on the fire escape, had quite a garden up there. Loved lilacs especially. Always smelled like them when you passed her in the hall." "What happened to her?" I asked. Mrs. Chen's expression grew somber. "Found her at the bottom of the basement stairs. Poor thing must have gotten confused. Wandered down there somehow. Door wasn't supposed to be unlocked, but you know how these old buildings are. Always something not quite right." The elevator reached her floor, and she stepped out, leaving me with this new information. Mrs. Delacroix, woman who had lived in my apartment, who had died in the basement, who had smelled like lilacs. The coincidence felt too pointed to ignore, though I couldn't quite articulate what it meant. That evening, I stood in my apartment and looked around with new eyes. Had Mrs. Delacroix stood in this same spot? Had she looked out these same windows? Listened to the same radiator noises? Walked past that same basement door every day? I found myself studying the apartment for traces of her presence, though what traces could survive 15 years and multiple tenants? The dreams intensified. Now, in them, I wasn't alone in the basement. There was someone else there, always just around the next corner or in the next room. I could hear footsteps on the concrete floor, the rustle of fabric, sometimes what sounded like someone humming softly to themselves. The scent of lilacs was overwhelming in these dreams, so strong it made me dizzy. I would wake up with the taste of flowers in my mouth and the absolute certainty that I had been somewhere else, somewhere real and immediate and important. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I would find myself standing in my hallway at 3 in the morning, fully dressed, with no memory of how I had gotten there. The basement door would be open, that familiar gap of darkness, beckoning. During one of these nocturnal episodes, I finally gathered the courage to approach the door more closely than I ever had before. The air that drifted from the opening was noticeably cooler, and carried that floral scent so strongly it was almost suffocating. I could hear something from the darkness beyond, a sound like someone moving around in a large space. The echo of footsteps on concrete. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. Then, after a long moment, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was my own voice, faint and distant, calling back from somewhere deep in the basement. "Hello? Is someone there?" I ran back to my apartment and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching the building's history online. I found old newspaper articles about its construction, zoning disputes from the 1980s when it was converted to residential use, even a few pieces about various incidents over the years. But I found no mention of Mrs. Delacroix or her death. I did find something else, though. A small item from 2003 about a gas leak in the building's basement that had required the evacuation of all residents for 3 days while repairs were made. The article mentioned that the basement level had been permanently sealed afterward as a safety precaution. If that was true, then the door I'd been seeing open and close should have led nowhere, should have opened onto a wall or empty space. I printed out the article and took it to Mr. Kowalski's office in the basement of the building. His door was open, and I could see him inside, surrounded by maintenance manuals and repair orders, looking more overwhelmed than ever. "Mr. Kowalski," I said, holding up the printout, "I found this article about the basement being sealed. Is the basement behind that door on the 3rd floor actually accessible?" He looked up from his paperwork, squinting at the article. "Oh, yeah, that whole section got walled off after the gas leak. City inspector said it was the safest option. Door's just decorative now, really. Opens onto a brick wall. But I've seen it open," I said, "multiple times. He studied me for a moment, and I could see him making a calculation about whether I was worth taking seriously. Finally, he sighed and stood up. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you something." We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and he led me to the basement door. In his presence, it was firmly closed, as I had expected. He pulled out a large ring of keys, and found one that fit the lock I had somehow never noticed before. "Door's been locked since I started working here 5 years ago," he said, turning the key. "Previous super gave me the key, told me never to open it unless there was an emergency." The door swung open to reveal exactly what he had said. A brick wall, professionally constructed, with mortars that looked relatively fresh. There was no basement beyond, no darkness, no source for the cool air or the floral scent. Just brick and mortar, sealing off whatever had once been there. "See," he said, closing the door and locking it again. "Nothing there. Maybe you're seeing the door to the utility closet down the hall. Easy to get confused in these old buildings." But I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't the utility closet. That night, alone in my apartment, I tried to make sense of what Mr. Kowalski had shown me. If the basement was sealed off, if there was nothing but a brick wall behind the door, then what had I been seeing all these months? What was the source of the sounds, the smells, the dreams that felt more real than reality? I began to consider possibilities that I had previously dismissed. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, some psychological episode brought on by stress or isolation. Maybe the dreams and the open door and the scent of lilacs were all symptoms of a mind that was losing its grip on objective reality. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain against my windows, I heard it again. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. The soft click of a door opening, and then, drifting under my apartment door, the unmistakable scent of lilacs. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by the same flickering fluorescent lights as always. But the basement door was open, that familiar gap of darkness visible even from my doorway. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped into the hallway. The air was noticeably cooler, and the floral scent was so strong it made me lightheaded. As I approached the basement door, I could hear something from beyond the opening. Not the echo of my own voice this time, but something that sounded like weeping. Soft, mournful sobs that seemed to come from a great distance. I reached the door and looked through the gap. Instead of the brick wall Mr. Kowalski had shown me, I saw darkness. Concrete steps leading down into a basement that should not have existed. The weeping was clearer now, definitely the sound of someone in distress. "Mrs. Delacroix," I called softly. The weeping stopped. After a moment, I heard footsteps on the concrete steps, someone climbing toward me. Slow, careful steps, as if the person climbing was elderly or unsteady. I should have run. Every instinct told me to return to my apartment, lock the door, and pretend this wasn't happening. But I found myself transfixed, waiting to see who or what would emerge from that impossible basement. A hand appeared first, gripping the edge of the door frame. An elderly woman's hand, with thin fingers and skin like paper, then an arm, then a shoulder, and finally a face. She was perhaps 70 years old, with white hair pinned up in an old-fashioned style and wearing a floral dress that might have been fashionable decades ago. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they fixed on mine with an intensity that made me take a step backward. "You've been hearing me?" she said, and her voice was exactly what I had imagined. Soft, cultured, with the faint trace of an accent I couldn't place. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I've been trying to get back," she continued. "Back to my apartment, back to my garden. But the door only opens when someone like you is here. Someone who can see." "You're Mrs. Delacroix?" I said. She smiled sadly. I lived where you live now. Had such beautiful flowers on the fire escape. Lilacs were my favorite. But you died," I said. Mrs. Chen told me you fell down the basement stairs. Her expression grew troubled. I remember being confused, lost. I came down here looking for something, but I can't remember what. And then, I couldn't find my way back. The door was locked when I tried to return. She stepped fully into the hallway, and I could see that she cast no shadow under the fluorescent lights. The floral scent intensified, no longer pleasant but overwhelming, like flowers left too long in a closed room. I've been waiting, she said, trying to get back to my apartment, to my garden. But I can only come up when the door opens, and it only opens for people who can see beyond what's supposed to be there. I understood then why the door had only opened when I was alone, why others couldn't see what I saw. I was someone who could perceive the spaces between what was real and what was supposed to be real, the cracks in ordinary reality where the impossible leaked through. What do you want? I asked. To go home, she said simply. To see my flowers. One more time. To remember what I was looking for down there. I thought about this. My apartment had been her apartment. My windows had been her windows. The place where I lived was the place where she had been happiest, where she had tended her garden and lived her life before whatever confusion had led her to that fatal trip to the basement. Come with me, I said. We walked down the hallway together, past the other apartment doors, past the elevator, to my door. I unlocked it and held it open for her. She hesitated at the threshold, looking around the hallway as if seeing it for the first time in years. It looks the same, she said softly. The wallpaper, the lights, they never changed anything. She entered my apartment, and I watched as she moved through the rooms, touching furniture, looking out the windows, running her fingers along the walls. Her presence filled the space with that floral scent. But it was different now, fresher, more like living flowers than dried ones. My garden, she said, moving to the windows that faced the fire escape. Is it still there? I looked out the window. The fire escape was empty, had been empty since I'd lived there. But as she stood beside me, I could see them, pots and planters, lush with growth, lilac bushes heavy with purple blooms. The scent was overwhelming now, not unpleasant, but so intense it made the air thick and hard to breathe. Beautiful, she whispered. I remember now. I was looking for seeds in the basement. I'd stored them down there for the winter, but I got lost, and I couldn't find my way back. She turned to me, and her pale blue eyes were bright with tears that didn't fall. Thank you, she said, for letting me come home. The air in the apartment began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The scent of lilacs grew so strong, I could taste it, could feel it coating my throat and lungs. Mrs. Del began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. But the flowers remained visible on the fire escape for a few moments longer, purple blooms swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. Then they too faded, leaving only the empty metal grating and the rain beginning to fall outside. I stood alone in my apartment, breathing hard, wondering if I had imagined the entire encounter. But the floral scent lingered for hours, fading, slowly like the memory of a dream upon waking. The next morning, I walked past the basement door on my way to work. It was closed, and it remained closed every time I passed it after that. The cool air was gone, the mysterious sounds silenced. Whatever had been calling to me from that impossible basement had found what it was looking for. I never saw Mrs. Delacroix again, but sometimes, on rainy nights like this one, I catch the faint scent of lilacs drifting through my apartment. It's not unpleasant anymore, just a gentle reminder that some doors open not to new places, but to old ones. To the spaces where memory and longing intersect with the world we think we understand. The basement door stays closed now, but I've learned that closed doesn't always mean sealed. Some boundaries are more permeable than others, and some people, some stories, some needs are strong enough to find their way through the cracks in reality's facade. Listen to the rain falling against your window tonight. Feel how it creates a barrier between you and the outside world. wrapping you in solitude and silence. But remember that solitude isn't always empty, and silence isn't always quiet. Sometimes, in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, between sleeping and waking, between the living and the dead, doors open that were never meant to close. And sometimes, if you're someone who can see beyond what's supposed to be, there, you might find that you're exactly the person someone has been waiting for. My grandfather's car turned itself on last night. Let the rain carry you away from the day's worries. Let it wash over you like a gentle tide pulling you towards sleep. I can hear it now, tapping against the glass, creating that perfect cocoon of sound that makes everything else feel distant and dreamlike. Tonight, as you settle into the darkness behind your closed eyes, I want to share something with you. Something that happened to me just last week. Something I'm still trying to understand. You know how certain objects can hold memories, can carry the weight of all the hands that have touched them, all the lives they've witnessed. I never believed that before. I thought it was just sentiment, the way we project meaning onto things that are, fundamentally, just metal and plastic and glass. But I was wrong. Some things do remember. Some things hold on to the people who loved them, long after those people are gone. My grandfather's car has been sitting in my driveway for 8 months now. A 1987 Buick LeSabre, deep blue with a vinyl interior that still smells like his aftershave, and the peppermint candies he always kept in the glove compartment. When he passed away last spring, my grandmother asked if I wanted it. She couldn't bear to sell it, she said, but she couldn't bear to look at it either. Sitting there in their garage like a monument to all the places they'd never go together again. I took it because I thought it was the right thing to do. Grandpa Joe had been teaching me about cars since I was old enough to hold a wrench, and this particular car had been his pride. He'd bought it used in 1994 and spent the next 29 years maintaining it with the kind of obsessive care that only comes from true love. Every Sunday morning, he'd be out there in the driveway, washing and waxing, checking the oil, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. The car ran perfectly when I inherited it. Grandpa had made sure of that. But I already had a car, and honestly, the LeSabre felt too big, too much like driving around in someone else's skin. So I parked it in my driveway and told myself I'd decide what to do with it eventually. Maybe I'd drive it sometimes. Maybe I'd sell it to someone who would appreciate what Grandpa had built. But for now, it could just sit there, a blue monument to good intentions and complicated grief. For the first few months, I barely thought about it. I'd see it when I came and went, parked behind my own car, like a patient guest, waiting for attention. Sometimes I'd notice a thin layer of dust on the windshield, leaves gathering around the tires, and I'd feel a pang of guilt about letting Grandpa's careful work go to waste. But I'd tell myself I'd deal with it later, when the emotions weren't so raw, when I could think about him without feeling that hollow ache in my chest. The first strange thing happened in September. I woke up one morning to find the car's headlights on, not the bright beams, just the parking lights, glowing faintly in the early dawn like tired eyes. I assumed I'd somehow triggered them the day before, when I'd walked past the car, maybe brushed against a sensor or something. Modern cars are full of systems that seem to activate on their own. But the LeSabre wasn't modern. It was from an era when cars were simpler, when lights came on because you pulled a knob or flipped a switch, not because some computer decided they should. Still, I turned them off and didn't think much about it. Car electrical systems can be quirky, especially in older vehicles. Wires can corrode, connections can become loose. It was probably nothing. The second time it happened was 3 weeks later. Again, the parking lights were on when I left for work in the morning. This time, I was more thorough in my inspection. I checked the light switch, which was firmly in the off position. I opened the hood and looked at the battery connections, which seemed solid. I even called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, to ask if she'd seen anyone near the car during the night. She hadn't. I started paying more attention to the car after that. Not obsessively, just casual glances when I came and went. Mental notes about its position and condition. I noticed that the dust I'd expected to accumulate on the windshield never quite seemed to build up. The car looked somehow maintained, as if someone was taking care of it while I wasn't watching. In October, the lights incident happened 3 more times. Always the parking lights, never the headlights or hazards. Always discovered in the morning when I left for work. I began to wonder if there was some kind of electrical drain that was affecting the system. Maybe a slow battery discharge that was triggering some kind of fail-safe mode. I bought a multimeter and started checking the battery voltage, but it was always normal, always exactly where it should be for a healthy battery. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when I was coming home late from dinner with friends. It was around 11:30 and the street was quiet, most of my neighbors already asleep. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept across. The LeSabre and I saw something that made me stop and stare. The car was running, not just the lights this time, but the engine. I could see the faint movement of the exhaust in the cool air, could hear the gentle purr of the V6 engine that Grandpa had kept in perfect tune. The headlights were on, casting long beams down the empty street, and I could see the dashboard lights glowing through the windshield. I sat in my own car for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone would have had to unlock the car, get inside, and start it. But I had the only set of keys, and they were in my pocket. I'd checked the locks regularly, and they were always secure. The car had no remote start system, no way to turn it on without physically being inside and turning the key. I got out of my car and approached the LeSabre cautiously, as if it might suddenly lurch forward or transform into something else entirely. The engine sound was exactly as I remembered it from riding with Grandpa all those years. That particular rhythm, that specific harmony of mechanical components that made this car unique among all others. I tried the driver's door handle, expecting it to be locked, but it opened smoothly. The interior light came on, revealing the familiar brown vinyl seats, the spotless dashboard, the air freshener shaped like a pine tree that Grandpa had hung from the rearview mirror. Everything was exactly as it had been the last time I'd looked inside, except for one thing. The radio was on, tuned to AM 1010, playing big band music at a low volume. Glenn Miller, I think, though I'm not sure. It was the kind of music Grandpa had loved, the soundtrack of his youth that he'd never quite outgrown. He used to say that modern music was too complicated, that the old songs had everything you needed, melody, rhythm, and words you could understand. I slid into the driver's seat, my hands automatically going to the steering wheel that had been shaped by decades of Grandpa's grip. The car felt alive around me, not just running but somehow alert, as if it was aware of my presence. The heater was on, warming the interior to the exact temperature Grandpa had always preferred. Even the seat was adjusted to his settings, which meant someone had moved it from where I'd left it months ago. I turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence, trying to understand what had happened. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the car had some kind of security system I didn't know about, something Grandpa had installed without telling anyone. Maybe there was a short in the electrical system that was causing random activation of various components. But as I sat there in the dark, breathing in the familiar scent of aftershave and peppermint, listening to the engine tick and cool, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about faulty wiring or hidden security systems. This felt intentional, purposeful, as if the car had started itself for a reason. Over the next few weeks, it happened 3 more times. Always late at night, always when I was coming home from somewhere. The car would be running, radio tuned, to that same AM station, interior warmed to Grandpa's preferred temperature. Each time, I would sit in the driver's seat for a few minutes, feeling like I was intruding on some private moment. Before turning off the engine and returning to my house. I started researching the car's history. looking for any modification or system that might explain the behavior. I called the dealership where Grandpa had bought it, talked to mechanics who had worked on it over the years, even contacted the previous owner. None of them could explain how a 1987 Buick could start itself. The dreams began in November. In them, I was riding with Grandpa again, the way I had as a child. We were driving through landscapes I didn't recognize, past houses and towns that seemed familiar, but wrong somehow, as if they were places I'd been in other dreams. Grandpa was younger in these dreams, maybe 50 or 60, his hair still dark. At the temples, his hands steady on the wheel. We never talked much during these dream drives, just listened to the radio and watched the scenery pass by. But there was a sense of purpose to our journey, a feeling that we were going somewhere specific, somewhere important. I would wake up with the taste of peppermint in my mouth and the phantom sensation of vinyl seats against my back. In the dreams, the car never felt old or outdated. It felt timeless, like something that had always existed and always would. The engine ran with perfect smoothness. The radio picked up stations that played music I'd never heard, but somehow knew by heart. And Grandpa drove with the confidence, ease of someone who knew exactly where he was going. I began to look forward to these dreams, to the nights when I would find myself back in the passenger seat of the Lesaber. They felt more real than my waking hours, more vivid and immediate than my daily routine of work and sleep and ordinary concerns. In the dreams, I was connected to something larger than myself, part of a story that stretched back generations. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in late November. I'd been working late, staying at the office, until almost midnight to finish a project deadline. When I finally got home, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open as I pulled into my driveway. But there was the LeSabre, running again, headlights cutting through the darkness like beacons. This time, instead of just turning off the engine and going inside, I decided to drive it. I don't know what prompted this decision. It certainly wasn't rational, but something about the way the car sat there, patient and ready, made me feel like it was waiting for something more than just my brief presence. I got into the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors, though they were already positioned perfectly. The car felt different when it was running, more responsive, more alive. I backed out of the driveway and began driving through my neighborhood, letting the car guide me rather than choosing a destination myself. We drove through streets I'd lived near 4 years but rarely explored, past houses where people slept peacefully behind lighted windows. The radio played softly, that same big band music that seemed to emanate from the car itself rather than any external broadcast. The heater kept the interior at that perfect temperature, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the drive. After about 20 minutes, the car began to turn down streets I didn't recognize, though we couldn't have traveled far from my neighborhood. The houses here were older, set back from the road behind mature trees that formed canopies over the pavement. Streetlights were fewer, and the darkness between them felt deeper, more profound. The car pulled into the driveway of a small house, with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under the windows. I recognized it immediately, though I hadn't seen it in over 15 years. It was Grandpa and Grandma's first house, the one they'd lived in when I was very young, before they'd moved to the bigger place where Grandpa had eventually died. I sat in the driveway, engine idling, looking at the house where some of my earliest memories had been formed. The current owners had painted it a different color and added modern fixtures, but the basic structure was the same. I could see the bedroom window, where Grandma used to lean out to call us in for dinner. The corner of the yard where Grandpa had taught me to throw a baseball. The car's radio crackled, and through the static, I heard something that made me grip the steering wheel tighter. It was Grandpa's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name the way he used to when I was small. Not urgent or frightened, just that familiar tone of affection and patience that had made me feel safe and valued. "Jimmy," the voice said through the radio static. "Jimmy, are you listening?" I reached for the radio knob with shaking hands, trying to tune the signal more clearly. But as soon as I touched the controls, the voice faded, replaced by the normal programming of whatever station we'd been receiving. "Grandpa," I said aloud, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. "Are you there?" The radio remained silent except for the distant sound of trumpets and saxophones. But the car began to move again, backing out of the driveway without any input from me. My hands were on the steering wheel. My foot was near the pedals, but I wasn't controlling anything. The car was driving itself, taking me somewhere else. We drove for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard never seemed to change, through neighborhoods that grew older and more familiar, past landmarks I remembered from childhood visits to my grandparents. The grocery store where Grandma had always bought my favorite cookies. The park where Grandpa had pushed me on the swings. The ice cream shop where we'd shared Sundays on hot summer afternoons. Eventually, we arrived at a cemetery I recognized. Grandpa was buried there, in a plot he'd chosen years before his death, because it was on a hill with a view of the valley where he'd grown up. The car stopped at the gates, which were closed and locked for the night. But somehow, we were inside anyway, driving slowly along the narrow paved roads between the headstones. The car's headlights illuminated row after row of markers, some old and weathered, others newer and stark. I found myself thinking about all the stories buried here, all the lives that had ended and the people who remembered them. The car stopped beside a familiar headstone, and I read Grandpa's name carved into the granite. Joseph Edmund Morrison, beloved husband and grandfather, the dates of his birth and death, the simple inscription Grandma had chosen. He fixed everything he touched. I turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence, looking at the grave of the man who had taught me so much about cars and life, and the importance of taking care of the things you love. The cemetery was completely quiet. No wind in the trees, no distant traffic sounds, just the profound stillness of a place where time moves differently. After a few minutes, I heard the car door open and felt the vehicle settle slightly as someone got into the passenger seat. I didn't turn to look, but I knew who it was. I could smell his aftershave, could hear the familiar rustle of his jacket as he settled into the seat beside me. "Been taking good care of her?" Grandpa asked, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it. Warm and slightly raspy from decades of cigarettes he'd quit before I was born, with that hint of amusement that suggested he was always on the verge of sharing some gentle joke. "I haven't been driving her much," I admitted, still looking straight ahead at his headstone. "I wasn't sure what to do with her." "She's been lonely," he said, "sitting in your driveway all these months, remembering all the places we used to go together. Cars like this, they're not meant to sit still. They're meant to move, to carry people to the places they need to be." I finally turned to look at him, and he was exactly as I remembered from my childhood, maybe 60 years old, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore the blue cardigan sweater Grandma had knitted for him, the one he'd worn every evening when he sat in his chair reading the newspaper. "I miss you, Grandpa," I said, and my voice sounded small and lost in the vastness of the cemetery. "I know you do," he said gently, "but I'm not really gone, you know. Part of me is in everything I fixed, everything I took care of. This car, especially. I put so much of myself into keeping her running. She remembers my hands on her steering wheel, my foot on her pedals." He reached over and patted the dashboard affectionately, the way he used to when he was particularly pleased with how the engine was running. "She's been trying to tell you something," he continued. "Every time she starts herself up, every time the lights come on, she's saying she's ready. Ready to take you places, ready to be part of your life, the way she was part of mine. I don't know how to take care of her the way you did," I said. "I don't know all the things you knew about engines and maintenance." Grandpa smiled, and it was the same expression I remembered from all those Sunday mornings when he'd been teaching me about carburetors and oil changes. Patient and encouraging even when I made mistakes. "You don't need to know everything, right? Away, he said. Just listen to her. Pay attention to the sounds she makes, the way she feels when you're driving. Cars will tell you what they need if you know how to listen. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, grandfather and grandson, sharing the space where so many of our conversations had taken place over the years. The car felt warm around us, protective, like a shelter from the loneliness and confusion that had been following me since his death. "Will I see you again?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Every time you drive her," he said. "Every time you take care of something that needs taking care of. I'm in the work, Jimmy. In the love you put into maintaining the things that matter." He opened the passenger door and got out, but before he closed it, he leaned down and looked at me through the window. "Don't let her sit still too long," he said. "She's got places to take you, if you'll let her." Then he was gone, and I was alone in the cemetery with the car and the sound of my own breathing. I started the engine and drove home slowly, taking the longest route I could think of, letting the LeSabre stretch her legs after months of sitting dormant. When I got home, I didn't just park the car and go inside. I spent an hour checking the oil, testing the lights, running my hands over the paint the way Grandpa used to. The car responded to my attention, engine purring with satisfaction, headlights bright and clear. Since that night, I've been driving the LeSabre regularly, to work sometimes, on weekend errands, on long drives through the countryside, when I need to think or remember. The car runs perfectly, as if 36 years and 180,000 miles are nothing more than numbers on a odometer. Sometimes, when I'm driving, alone at night, with the radio playing softly, I catch a hint of aftershave in the air, or hear what sounds like someone humming along with the music. The car feels less like a machine, and more like a companion, something that carries not just my body from place to place, but the memories and love that connect me to the man who taught me that taking care of things is another way of taking care of people. Listen to the rain on your windows tonight, and think about the objects in your life that carry the weight of other hands, other hearts. The chair where someone you loved used to sit, the tools they used to fix the things that broke, the car they drove to all the places that mattered to them. These things remember, and if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the stories they're trying to tell, you might find that the people you've lost are never as far away as you thought they were. My grandfather's car turned itself on last night, and I finally understood what it was trying to say. It was saying that love doesn't end when people do, that the care we put into the world continues long after we're gone, carried forward by the things we've touched and the people we've taught to listen. The old trail markers whisper when you pass them, "Close your eyes now, and let the rain wash over everything outside your window." Pull your blankets a little closer, settle into that familiar hollow your body has made in the mattress, and listen. The rain has a way of making stories feel more real, doesn't it? Like it's washing away the boundaries between what happened and what might happen, between memory and dream. Tonight, I want to tell you about something that happened to me last autumn, something I've been trying to understand ever since. It's the kind of story that feels different when you hear it in the rain, when the world outside has gone soft and muffled, when shadows pool in corners and the familiar becomes strange. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let me take you back to October, to a trail I thought I knew, two markers that shouldn't have been able to speak. I moved to Millbrook in September, renting a small cabin on the edge of the Blackwood National Forest. The real estate agent had mentioned the hiking trails as a selling point, and after 3 years of city living, the idea of having wilderness at my doorstep felt like exactly what I needed. The cabin was simple, 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 1 person, a living room dominated by a stone fireplace that I suspected hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had windows that looked out into the forest, and on clear mornings, the light filtering through the pine trees made everything feel possible again. The trail system was well maintained, with wooden markers every quarter mile, bearing numbers and arrows pointing toward various loops and destinations. Trail 7 became my regular route, a moderate 3-mile loop that wound through stands of birch and maple, past a small creek that ran clear and cold. Even in the driest months, I'd take it 3 or 4 times a week, usually in the early evening when the light turned golden and the forest felt like it was settling into itself for the night. It was on my 15th walk along Trail 7 that I first noticed something odd about marker post number 23. The post stood at a bend in the trail where the path curved around a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't have encircled it. I'd passed this marker dozens of times, had even rested against it once while retying my boot. But that evening in early October, as the leaves were just beginning to turn, I could have sworn I heard something as I walked past, a whisper, soft and indistinct, like someone speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I stopped walking and turned back toward the marker, but there was nothing, just the usual forest sounds of wind through branches and the distant call of a woodpecker. I stood there for a full minute, listening, but heard only the ordinary symphony of the woods. I chalked it up to fatigue. I'd been working long hours at my new job, and stress had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But 3 days later, it happened again. This time, I was certain. As I passed marker 23, I heard what sounded like a voice, low and urgent, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. The sound seemed to come from the post itself, from the weathered wood that had stood in that spot for what must have been decades. I approached the marker slowly, ran my hand along its surface. The wood was rough and gray with age, carved with the usual trail information. 23, Trail 7, overlook 0.5 miles. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have been able to make sound. I began paying closer attention to the other markers. There were 12 posts along the 3-mile loop, and over the next week, I started to notice that they all seemed to whisper as I passed. It was subtle at first, so quiet I might have been imagining it, but gradually, the sounds became more distinct. Not words exactly, but the cadence and rhythm of speech, like listening to a conversation in another room, with the door mostly closed. Marker 19, where the trail descended toward the creek, seemed to sigh as I walked by. The sound was unmistakably human, a long exhalation full of weariness or loss. Marker 27, positioned at the trail's highest point where you could see across the valley to the distant mountains, made a sound like someone calling out, though whether in greeting or warning, I couldn't tell. I started walking the trail at different times of day, trying to understand the pattern. The whispers were strongest in the evening, around the time I usually took my walks, but they were present during morning hikes too, just fainter. On weekends, when other hikers used the trail, the sounds seemed to fade entirely. It was as if the markers only spoke when they thought no one was listening, or when they recognized something familiar in my solitary footsteps. The possibility that I was losing my mind occurred to me. Of course, isolation could do strange things to people, and I'd been through a difficult year before moving to Millbrook, but the whispers felt too real, too consistent. They had a quality to them that my imagination had never managed before, weight and presence that seemed to exist outside my own mind. I decided to do some research. The Millbrook Historical Society was housed in a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street, staffed by volunteers who seemed genuinely excited to have someone show interest in local history. Mrs. Henley, the society's president, was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair and the kind of gentle authority that made you want to confess things you'd never told anyone. Trail 7, she said when I mentioned my interest. Oh, that's one of the older trails. Been there since the 1940s, maybe earlier. Are you having trouble with it? Some people find it a bit ... intense. Intense how? She studied my face for a moment, as if deciding whether I could be trusted with something important. Well, it wasn't always a hiking trail. During the war, it was part of a training route for soldiers. They used those woods for exercises, survival training, that sort of thing. Not many people know that anymore. What kind of training? The kind they didn't talk about much, even then. This was 1943, 1944. They were preparing men for operations behind enemy lines. Dangerous work. Most of them never came back from overseas. She paused, running her finger along the spine of a thick photo album. The trail markers they put up then weren't like the ones now. They were code markers, with numbers that meant something to the men who'd been trained to read them. After the war, the Forest Service put up their own posts, but they kept the same locations. Easier that way. Do you know what happened to the men who trained there? Mrs. Henley's expression grew distant. 47 of them went overseas. 12 came home. The rest are buried in places whose names we're not supposed to know. She opened the photo album and turned it toward me. The black and white photographs showed young men in military fatigues, standing in formation among trees I recognized. They say the woods remember things. Old places do, you know. They hold on to the important moments, the ones that matter. I studied the photographs. The faces were young, serious, marked by the particular gravity of men who knew they might not survive what was coming. In one photo, I could see marker posts in the background different from the current ones, but positioned in locations that looked familiar. Mrs. Henley, I said carefully, have you ever heard of people reporting unusual experiences on that trail? She closed the album slowly. What kind of experiences? Sounds. Voices, maybe. Oh, she was quiet for a long moment. Yes, a few. People over the years. Usually folks who hike alone, who spend a lot of time out there. The trail gets to know you after a while, I think. Starts to trust you with its secrets. That evening, I walked Trail 7 with new understanding. The whispers seemed louder now, more urgent. As I approached marker 23, I slowed my pace and listened carefully. The voice was clearer than it had ever been before, young man's voice, speaking words that sounded like coordinates or compass bearings. Northeast, 270 yards, marked tree. Then, fainter. Tell them we made it this far. At marker 19, the sighing sound resolved into something that might have been a name, Sarah, repeated 3 times, with a particular tenderness, reserved for someone beloved and far away. Marker 27 was different. Instead of calling out, the voice there was speaking to someone close by, giving instructions. Keep low when you cross the clearing. Use the big oak for cover. Stay quiet. I began to understand that I was hearing fragments of conversations. Moments preserved in wood and time like insects trapped in amber. The trail markers had become repositories for the last communications, of men who knew they might never have another chance to speak. The realization should have been comforting, explanation grounded in history rather than madness, but instead, it filled me with a growing sense of responsibility. These voices had been speaking for decades, unheard and unacknowledged. The dead were trying to send messages, and I was the only one listening. I started bringing a notebook on my walks, writing down what I heard at each marker. The fragments began to form patterns, pieces of a larger story. The men had been practicing for a mission that would take them deep into occupied Europe. They'd left messages for loved ones at home, for comrades who might come after them, for anyone who might remember that they had been here. Marker 15, positioned where the trail forked toward an abandoned fire tower, carried what sounded like a prayer. Watch over Mom and Dad. Tell them I was thinking of them at the end. Marker 31, near a small clearing where wildflowers still bloomed despite the autumn frost, held a love letter. Jenny, if you're listening, I kept my promise. I thought of you every day. Some markers carried tactical information warnings about enemy positions, notes about safe routes, observations about weather patterns that might affect a mission planned 70 years ago. Others held more personal messages, birthday wishes, that would never be delivered, apologies that would never be heard, declarations of love that had been spoken to empty air, The weight of these accumulated voices began to affect my sleep. I'd lie in bed listening to the rain on the cabin roof, thinking about young men who'd walked the same paths I walked, who'd stood where I stood and known they were probably going to die. The trail markers had become their final confessional, their last chance to speak into a world that might outlast them. I started spending longer periods at each marker, standing quietly and listening not just to the words but to the emotions beneath them. Fear, yes, but also determination. Loneliness tempered by duty. Love that transcended the possibility of death. These weren't the voices of men who'd given up hope. They were the voices of people who'd found ways to remain human in circumstances designed to strip away humanity. It was on a particularly rainy evening in late October that everything changed. The whispers had been growing stronger over the weeks, and that night they seemed almost conversational, as if the markers were speaking directly to me rather than simply replaying old recordings. I'd reached marker 23 when I heard something that made me stop completely. "You've been listening." The voice was the same one I'd been hearing for weeks, young Ernest, carrying a slight accent that might have been from the Midwest. But this time, the words were clearly meant for me. We wondered if anyone would ever hear us. I stood perfectly still, rain dripping from my hood, not sure if I should respond or run. The rational part of my mind suggested that isolation and suggestion had finally pushed me over the edge into full delusion, but the voice felt too real, too present. "You don't have to say anything," the voice continued. "We know you're listening. That's enough. That's more than we've had in a long time." I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want? Just to be remembered? To know that someone knows we were here?" A pause. My name was Daniel Kowalski. I was 22. I grew up in Chicago, wanted to be a teacher after the war. I made it through the training, made it overseas. Didn't make it home. The rain seemed to grow heavier, creating a curtain of sound that isolated us from the rest of the world. Other voices began to join in from the different markers, creating a chorus of introduction that stretched along the entire trail. James McRitty, Detroit, Michigan. Wanted to run a garage with my brother. Tommy Sullivan, Boston. Had a girl named Rose waiting for me. Frank Delacroix, New Orleans. Played trumpet in a jazz band. Each voice carried its own particular weight of loss, its own interrupted story. But there was something else in their tone. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief, as if being heard had lifted some burden they'd been carrying alone. I walked the entire trail that night, stopping at each marker to listen as the dead introduced themselves and shared fragments of the lives they'd left behind. Some had died in the forests of France. Others had fallen in the mountains of Italy or the beaches of the Pacific. A few had made it home, only to die young from wounds that wouldn't heal or memories that wouldn't fade. But all of them had returned to this trail in some way, drawn back to the place where they'd prepared for the end of their lives, where they'd said goodbye to the people they'd been before the war, changed them into something else. As I completed the loop and headed back toward my cabin, I realized that the voices were growing fainter, not disappearing, but settling back into the wood, returning to their patient waiting. The conversation was over, for now. "Thank you," I said to the darkness and the rain. "Thank you," came the whispered response from dozens of voices, carried on the wind through the trees. I have continued walking Trail 7 through the winter months, though the voices are quieter now, less urgent. Sometimes I hear fragments of the old messages, coordinates that lead nowhere, names that mean nothing to anyone still living, love letters addressed to people who died decades ago. But more often, I hear something that sounds almost like contentment, as if the simple act of being heard has given them some measure of peace. The trail markers still whisper when I pass them, but now the whispers feel like conversations with old friends, rather than desperate attempts at communication. They share stories about the forest, point out changes in the weather, warn me when the trail conditions are dangerous. They've become my companions on these solitary walks. Voices from another time who've learned to find comfort in the present. Sometimes, when the rain is particularly heavy and the forest feels especially alive, I'll stop at marker 23 and ask Daniel about his dreams of teaching, or pause at marker 19 to hear Tommy describe his rose. They tell me about a world that existed before I was born, about hopes and fears that feel both utterly foreign and completely familiar. I've become the keeper of their stories now, the one who remembers their names and carries their messages forward into a world that has largely forgotten they ever existed. It's not a burden, it's a privilege to be trusted with someone's last words, to serve as witness to lives that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. The rain is slowing now, settling into the gentle patter that will carry through the night. In a few hours, the sun will rise, and the forest will take on its daylight personality, ordinary, explicable, free of mysteries. But the voices will still be there, patient in their wooden homes, waiting for the next solitary walker who might pause long enough to listen. They're waiting for you, perhaps. Trail 7 is still there, still marked by posts that hold more than directions and distances. If you ever find yourself walking alone through those woods, moving quietly enough to hear the whispers in the rain, you might discover that the dead have stories to tell, and that some secrets are too important to stay buried forever.